welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. After diving into the complicated alliance between Pakistan and the United States last month, this month's episode focuses on another unusual relationship, the India-Russia partnership. Now, India and Russia have been close partners ever since the 1970s, but ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, that relationship has been on somewhat of a back burner, sustained primarily on defense, cooperation, and eclipsed by the rapidly growing India-US strategic partnership. All that changed in February of 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The United States and its NATO allies responded not by deploying troops on the ground, but by applying sanctions to starve Russia of revenue from its most important export, oil and gas. But even as Europe slowly divested itself from its dependence on Russian energy, India went the other way. India, which imported less than 1% of its oil from Russia before 2022, now gets a staggering 40% of its oil imports from Russia as of August 2025. Now, to be fair, much of that oil is processed and re-exported to Europe, and India is far from the only country that's doing so. Turkey and China are doing pretty much the same thing. But India's decision in particular has drawn a lot of ire from the Trump administration, who claimed that India's purchase of Russian energy is fueling Russia's war in Ukraine, with one Trump official, Peter Navarro, going as far as to call the Ukraine conflict Modi's war. And examining that claim is going to be the focus of our episode. What is the story behind India's oil trade with Russia? Are India's oil purchases meaningfully contributing to the continuation of the war in Ukraine? And why does India, in defiance of Trump's sanctions, continue to purchase oil from Russia? We'll be speaking later to Ajay Srivastava, a former Indian civil servant and trade negotiator, to understand India's side of the story. But first, to understand the dynamics of the global energy market and how Russia is secretly defying sanctions to export its oil, we'll be speaking to one of the world's leading energy economists, Dr. Anas Alhajji. Stay tuned. So we're happy to be joined by Dr. Anas Alhajji, who is a world-renowned energy markets expert, researcher, author, and a speaker with more than 900 papers, articles, and columns to his credit. He is a managing partner at Energy Outlook Advisors, LLC, and focuses on the oil and gas market, energy geopolitics, energy security, and the impact of disruptive technologies on the supply and demand of energy. So perhaps one of the best qualified people in the world to discuss the dynamics of the international energy market and sanctions regime, as well as the truth behind the India-Russia oil trade. So Anas, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Anas, just to begin with, I've seen a few of your previous interviews, and you've described the oil industry as an intersection of politics, economics, and everything else. I wonder if you could set the stage by giving our listeners an overview of the global energy trade. Who are the main players? How are the prices set? And what are the most important developments going on right now? And could you also help our listeners understand the roles that India and Russia respectively play in the global energy trade, at least prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022?
Sure. The oil industry in its current form is 160 years old, probably 170 if you want to start from Baku and Russia. And one thing is clear from the history of the oil industry, that oil is strategic and political commodity. Even OPEC members, especially Saudi Arabia, try to depoliticize it. The other sides will politicize it, and if they do it, then it's politicized anyway. So it is a political commodity. The second fact about this is that the oil market is not competitive. It's never been competitive. And therefore, any analysis of the market using kind of competitive models do not make any sense. At the same time, we don't have a cartel like some media outlets are talking about. And the reason why, because oil is a natural resource. And one of the mistakes we have in the media and among various analysts, especially those who are not economists or even financial analysts, they ignore the fact that when we talk about economics, the economics we learned in Econ 101 focuses mostly on industrial products. But natural resource economics is completely different from the regular economics that people know about. because of depletion, and that is a big problem for all minerals and for all the extractive industry. And therefore, when it comes to oil and most of the minerals, basically, their markets have to be managed. And because it has to be managed, we are not talking about cartels here. This is the nature of the industry. So if you look at the oil industry for the last 170 years, you see that there is some relative stability in the market when the market was managed. We have chaos when the market was not managed. And therefore, this management of the market has to be understood as is good for everyone. Now, do they do mistakes? Yes, we end up with some mistakes, but the market has to be managed because of the nature of the industry. So that's how complex the industry is. On one side, it is a strategic commodity. On the other, it's political. And on the other side, naturally, it has to be managed. And that's widely misunderstood in the market. The other issue is it just happened that historically, coal existed in what we know later as the advanced economies. So we talk about Europe, we talk about the United States, and others. While oil basically existed in the poorer countries historically, in the developing countries. That created other problems too. And to talk about the politics of the oil industry, politics basically became the nature of the industry when the British Navy was converted from coal to oil. And all of a sudden now, you have the British fleet fighting all over the world and say, well, it uses oil and therefore oil is strategic to us and therefore we have to own it. And then the British government literally owned BP, what we know now as BP. So they got involved heavily, and that's how the politics basically started. It's older than that, but it became kind of very influential in terms of energy markets when the British Navy basically switched from coal to oil. If you look around the world right now, the largest oil producer in the world is the United States of America. It's not OPEC members, it's not Saudi Arabia, it's the United States. And if you look at the top producers in the world, what do you see? You see the United States, you see Russia, you see Norway, you see Brazil. Those are not even in the Middle East, yet the reputation basically is for the Middle East. The OPEC members, we have 12 OPEC members, and the Gulf states, that's Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and UAE, and Iraq basically are part of that. And then we have something called OPEC Plus. After the collapse in oil prices in 2015, the OPEC members basically felt that we have large producers who are not OPEC members, and they are benefiting from our cuts while they are not contributing anything. And therefore, we are going to maintain our production at highest level as long as those guys do not cooperate. If they cooperate with us and they start cutting production, then we will cut production. And 2015 was extremely painful for everyone. As a result, 10 countries joined the group of OPEC, and they formed what we know now as OPEC Plus. So we have 12 countries from OPEC, we have 10 countries above that, so we have 22 countries, and that include Russia and Kazakhstan, Oman, in that group. And then within this group, we have something called the group of 8. Sometimes we label it as V8. And this group basically decided to do voluntary cuts that are different from OPEC Plus and different from OPEC. So we have OPEC, we have OPEC Plus, and we have the group of 8. We have a general mistake in the media when the group of 8 cut or increased production. They say OPEC Plus did this, OPEC Plus will do this. That's not the case. OPEC Plus is completely separate as an entity from the group of 8. And the group of 8 basically decided to cut voluntarily twice, and now they are returning that production to the market. They are done with the first patch, which is 2.2 million barrels a day, And now they started the second patch, which is 1.6 million barrels a day. And now they are going to meet on Sunday to decide what to do in November. Whether, of course, all options on the tables. There were rumors that they would expedite that and they would increase production above 500. This was officially denied by OPEC just a couple of days ago. So most likely they will go for the traditional 1.38, so 138,000 barrels a day, and they may not go for it at all. We don't know, but this is going to happen on Sunday. And the general belief in the market, and that's what the media be telling us, that oil prices declined because of this increase. This is a complete nonsense, because the decline in oil prices started way before the increase in production in those countries. And even when they decided to increase output, it did not increase. If you look at the global supply, the decision was to start increasing output in April. But if you look at their supply, which is their exports, it declined in April and May. It did not increase. So you have 5 months in the year, we don't have increase in supply. So why oil prices decline? Well, they declined for various reasons, mostly related to President Trump. You have the trade wars, you have the tariffs, and then you have all the immigration policies and all the visa policies and all the issues related to U.S. universities and foreign students that reduce jet fuel. And this is important because when we did our outlook at the end of 2024, the brightest spot in the oil complex was jet fuel. And Trump immigration policies, airport policies, visa policies killed it. So now we have a decline as a result of that. So it's not really related to OPEC+. And what people need to know about the Group of 8 decision, that the decision, when they meet and they say we are going to increase production by this much, that's really production ceiling. This is the quota. This is on paper. But what we see in the market is completely different and usually lower than that number. So those who are bearish, they are taking the headline number and saying, well, that's how much oil we are going to have. But we have enough evidence since April to show that the increase was way, way lower than the announced numbers. There are no reasons basically to be bearish. And I would like to expand on this point because it is important. Yes, U.S. oil production continued to increase, but at the same time, the U.S. is building its strategic petroleum reserves. So it's taking production from here, locking it up here. So that's not additional supply in the market. On the other side, where the bearish news is coming from, it's coming from the International Energy Agency and big banks. And then there are certain media outlets that have been promoting the bearish sentiment for a long time. And that bearish sentiment is literally manufactured. There is no basis for it on the ground. And I'm going to explain to the audience in details why it is manufactured, and then I will move to India. The International Energy Agency is saying that we are going to end up with 1.8 million barrels a day of surplus in 2025. We did not see that. And they said we are going to have the largest surplus ever in 2026. How do you end up with the largest surplus ever? You don't have COVID lockdowns. You don't have a recession. You have a growth in oil demand, and yet you end up with the largest surplus. How that's possible? So that's number one. But let's look at the record of the IEA, because right now the IEA think that oil demand in 2025 would increase by only 700,000 barrels a day. OPEC think it's 1.3 million barrels a day. We think it's 1.1 million barrels a day. So this 700, when they predict 700, let's look at the history of that. For 18 years in a row, the IEA has been underestimating global demand. In November 2022, the IEA, in its own report, said we've been, in a sense, they did not say it the way I'm saying it right now. I'm just kind of rephrasing this in my own way. They said we'd be wrong on oil demand. We underestimated oil demand, global oil demand. Since when? Since 2007. Again, the report is published in November 2022. They've been wrong for 15 years. And they revised all of that up. And when they did this in 22, they did it between 2007 and 2021. So let's pay attention to the dates here. Between 2007 and 2021, they revised all of that up. And then, just last May, said, sorry, we'd be wrong in 2022, 23, and 24. And they revised that up again. So you have 15 years plus 3 years, 18 years of being wrong. And by how much the revision between 22, 23, and 24? Look at this number, 350 million barrels. We are not talking about pocket change here. So you can see that there is an agenda basically to forecast our demand for some reason. But not only that, you go back to August report, and August, basically the IEA said, oops, sorry, we underestimated Mexican oil demand by 100,000 barrels a day. Since when? Since 2020. I mean, it's just becoming like a joke. And then you look at the IEA's forecast in 2015 for 2025, because they do the long-term forecast. In 2015, you look at the number in 2015, and then you look at the number of the IEA itself from its own report, and you find out that oil demand in 2025 is higher than their own estimate by 3.2 million barrels a day. So you have all this record of underestimation and being wrong, and you want me to believe them now for their bearish sentiment? But here's the problem. The problem is there is something we call circular information. Circular information, I face this on daily basis, and we criticize this in our reports almost on daily basis. Circular information, when someone comes to me and say, how dare you say this? This is not correct because look at this news. And I say, well, this news is fake. Say, what do you mean? It's published all around the world. And there are like multiple agencies and about 100 newspapers publishing it. And my response would be, yes, you are right. But it's all come to one source. So if 100 newspapers publishing it all from one source, still one source. It's not 100 source. So we have this circular information where things go around. So here's the problem. They say, well, but even Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and everyone else basically are supporting the IEA view. They are bearish and they think oil prices will decline. Well, that's fine. Let's remember the following. Remember when I told you about the 18 years of mistakes? And the revision between 2007 and 2021 was made in 2022. So if I am an analyst and taking IEA data and I'm storing it in my Excel sheet, I'm working on my forecast through that, guess what? Everyone is using the same data, the same source. And if they don't revise it in 2022 because they did not pay attention to the revision, they are still using the old data. So we have the circular information that is causing a lot of problems. And then you look at other factors, you'll see that, for example, they are saying that China built massive inventory and thus sustained prices. Otherwise, prices would be lower. And they show you how the increase in China's inventories. Well, they forget one thing, that when it comes to China, some of that increase in inventory basically is a revision, is an adjustment for storage facilities that not being counted before that was full of oil. So we have all kind of problems in this case, but our view is it's not that bearish, and we are going to end up with bearishness simply because of seasonality, not that extreme bearishness that we see in the market or that is reported by the IEA. Look at OPEC view and look at the large increase from the group of 8, and prices are still in the 60s, while analysts predicted that price would decline to the 30s. Why did it not decline? Because they were taking the IEA view, and the IEA view is wrong. Now when it comes to India. The recent news out of India that, by the way, this is not public yet. Bjorn would probably your show here had this information before others. We have some serious issues here because all of a sudden we are seeing a pile up of Russian tankers next to Vadinar refinery, which is owned by Nayar. As you know, this refinery was sanctioned by the EU because it is partly owned by a Russian company. And it is very clear that the company and India in general ignored the EU sanctions. I put on my Twitter account almost on a daily basis maps showing tankers that are sanctioned by the EU delivering oil to a sanctioned refinery, which is Vadinar refinery. So it is very clear that they did not care about the EU sanctions. But all of a sudden now we are seeing a pileup, and that pileup could be the result of problems within the refinery itself. And what we heard from some news reports that the refinery basically was going through maintenance, it needed certain spare parts, and they couldn't buy them from their regular suppliers because of the sanctions. And now they are trying to find other routes, basically. So this could be a reason for the buildup. Why this is important? Because the buildup has nothing to do with the sanctions on the tankers. The buildup has something to do with the sanctions on the spare parts of the refinery. So this is a clarification. The other one is the French Navy boarded this morning boarded a ship, an oil tanker that is carrying Urals crude to Vadinar. And this tanker basically is sanctioned tanker and delivering that oil to a sanctioned refinery. And this tanker being in trouble before with other nations for literally sailing without a flag. So we do have problems with this before. But what the mistake is here that the French Navy did not board this because of sanctions. This is important because people think, well, the EU started enforcing the sanctions. No. The reason why, because all of a sudden they saw several drones coming from that tanker, or supposedly coming from that tanker, over French land and Danish land and I think one of the airports. So they boarded that for security reasons because they think the Russians are using those oil tankers to spy on them. So this is very important to clarify that the EU is not enforcing the sanctions. There is a suspicion about drones coming out of that tanker, and that's why they boarded that. So this is the recent news, but we still have tankers coming to India, sanctioned tankers carrying Russian crude, and the India refineries are taking it. It seems there are problems with Nayara refinery. It could be related to spare parts or something else. This could be solved within a short period of time, which means that they will try to source it through other means to solve those problems. Now we go back to the tariffs on India. As you know, the Trump administration imposed 25% tariff on India, and then they imposed an additional 25% tariff because India is importing Russian crude. And that is really strange. And it's strange because the United States itself imports stuff from Russia. So they accused India of fueling the war and financing Putin. But U.S. imports this year are higher. I'm talking that's different types of imports, including enriched uranium, by the way. Their import this year is higher than the previous year. And no one accused the Trump administration or anyone else of financing the war. In August, 12% of EU gas imports came from Russia, that piped or LNG, and no one said anything about this. Turkey imports natural gas, crude, petroleum products, and export more petroleum products to EU than India, and yet no one said anything about Turkey. China imports massive amount of energy, way more than India, because they import gas via pipelines, they import LNG, and then they import oil. And the Trump administration did not accuse China of supporting the war in Ukraine. So this gives us the impression that it has nothing to do with the imports from Russia. And in fact, if you look at the recent development in Iraq by allowing the Kurdistan oil to go through the pipeline again to Jihan port in Turkey, what we see here is Turkey itself does not want that oil to go through because they have certain conditions, certain political conditions and financial conditions that were not met. But the Trump administration got involved heavily in this pipeline and in this operation. And how they pressured Turkey. They pressured Turkey by reminding them, oh, by the way, you import Russian oil. Remember what we did with India. What does that mean is the Trump administration is using the Russian imports as a tool to achieve other objectives not related to Russia at all, not related to Ukraine. They are using it as a tool to pressure other countries to achieve other things. For example, what is the pressure on India? India, with its largest population on earth, if you look at it on country basis, it is literally by population the largest market. And everyone wants access. So this is just could be one of the reasons why they are using the Russian imports as a tool to pressure India to accept certain things, including opening the largest market on earth, for example. So it is clear now from various pieces of evidence that the Russian oil imports are being used as a tool. Not the objective is to reduce Russian imports or prevent India from getting the Russian oil. One of the ironies here is that, and this is today's news, by the way, one of the ironies, and we are going to publish it we are going to publish a chart showing it in today's daily energy report. Despite the sanctions, despite the tariffs, India's diesel exports at their highest level ever. And India's diesel exports to Europe, and specifically to the EU, at their highest level ever. Despite the sanctions, despite the tariffs. So, does that mean something? Well, it means a couple of things. For example, on the political side related to sanctions, that sanctions not working and the tariffs are not working. Basically, that's what it is. But on the other side, are we seeing some slow economic growth in India? So therefore, there is more diesel to be exported. That remains to be seen because we still need more data on that. In general, if you look around the world, experts think that the largest growth in oil demand in the coming years will come from India. Despite all the efforts to focus on renewable energy and to focus on electric vehicles. So despite all of that, they expect that India to have the largest growth. And one of the reasons why India will be number one in terms of growth in oil demand, because China is following a strategic policy, and we can talk about it. That if you would like, if you think it is of interest to your audience, it is their strategic decision to reduce their energy or to reduce their seaborne energy imports. So anything related to that, simply because they expect either a war or heavy sanctions on them. And most of their imports basically come through the Malacca Strait, which is very easily can be controlled by any force. And therefore, they are working in a way where they can build up their inventories to record levels, which they did, that even in natural gas, not only in oil, in coal, they are building all the renewable energy simply because of that reason. So that naturally will make India number one in terms of demand growth anyway.
So I do want to get into the topic of China because they also play a major part in it, and as you've noted, continue to import oil and gas from Russia, but not too much. A lot of words, perhaps, but not too much action from the Trump administration. But I do want to take us back to the start of the Ukraine war, and in particular, President Biden's approach, because I've heard you speak at length about how the Biden administration acted in the lead up to the invasion, because they had to balance domestic inflation concerns alongside their existing sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. I wonder if you could take us through how Biden responded to the Russian invasion and how the sanction plan against Russia was designed and implemented while he was in office. And how effective do you believe these sanctions were in constraining Russian aggression while minimizing the impact on global oil prices?
In general, I have to remind the listeners that regardless of your views of President Biden spent 50 years in politics. He is a fox. So regardless of what happened to him at old age, etc., he's been a fox. So if you look at his policies, basically, he acted like a fox. He literally outsmarted everyone. And to look at it in various ways, because it's not only sanctions on Russia, we have the sanctions on Iran too, and the sanctions on Venezuela and how he worked it out. President Trump reimposed the sanctions on Iran in October 2018. So he revoked everything that Obama and Biden did in 2014. And what happened is when Biden came in, there were a couple of issues here that he needs to deal with. And when he wanted to renegotiate Jacoba, which is the nuclear deal they signed in 2014, and Trump stopped it. So he came in with a platform that he wanted to negotiate with Iran. So to keep the Iranians at the table negotiating in Vienna, he cannot continue the sanctions and enforcing the Trump sanctions on Iran. Because if they walk out, then the negotiations are over. So in his first year in office, we are talking about 2021, in his first year in office, he does not want to enforce the sanctions simply because he wants to keep the Iranians negotiating in Vienna. So he ignored the sanctions. He turned a blind eye to the sanctions in 2021. But by the end of 2021, he realized that the Iranians were lying and they were bluffing. So he got angry, and they were thinking, if you look at the negotiations and you look at the comments at that time, it was very clear that they were thinking about reinforcing the sanctions on Iran. So we are talking about the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. But let's remember what happened at that time. While the Biden administration was talking about reinforcing the sanctions, all of a sudden we got all the intelligence that Putin is going to go to Ukraine in December 21. But what we have at that time, we have the Olympics in China. So the president of China, basically called on Putin, please do not do it because you are going to ruin our Olympics. So the invasion of Ukraine got delayed until February 2023. Sorry, I messed up the dates here. 2022. So when the invasion took place in 2022, now the Biden administration is thinking, hold on just a second, I'm going to impose sanctions on Russia. I need the Iranian oil. So they did not enforce the sanctions. At the same time, he asked OPEC Plus members to increase production, and the OPEC Plus members refused because they saw that there is enough supply in the market. There is no reason for it. At the same time, Russia is an OPEC Plus member. If you go against it, you are breaking the coalition. So there is a political factor and economic factor. So they refused. But so the Biden administration basically decided to go and talk to Venezuela and talk to Iran, who are sanctioned. They said, look, we are going to keep the sanctions on paper, but we are going to work it out where you can increase production. So they give the permission to Iran to send oil to Europe, and they give European companies licenses basically to take oil from Venezuela to Europe. So there were two companies, Italian company and Spanish company, were given licenses basically to take the Venezuelan oil despite the sanctions. And at the same time, the Iranians took advantage of that, of course, because they wanted to invest in their own industry and they want to increase production. So they did. But there was something very interesting at that time. The Biden administration decided to withdraw oil from the strategic petroleum reserves, which is the largest withdrawal ever. At the same time, the Iranians had about 70 to 80 million barrels of oil stored on ships. We call it floating storage. And if you look at the releases from the strategic petroleum reserves in the United States and the releases from Iran, they correspond with each other perfectly. The correlation is almost 100%. So there was some sort of cooperation between Iran and the Biden administration. As long as oil prices are declining, the Biden administration does not care about the sanctions. So the Iranians liquidated all their floating storage, and they increased their exports substantially, and they exported to Europe too. They did this in 2022. Now we are into 2023. The Biden administration started getting angry because they were not able to get what they wanted from the Iranians in terms of the nuclear program. Israel was going crazy because they said, look, the Iranians are going to have a nuclear bomb tomorrow, etc. He wanted to reinforce the sanctions, but now he ended up with another problem. The other problem is the elections are coming up, and he does not want higher prices. So that's why during the Biden administration, we did not see reinforcement of the sanctions simply because of the various reasons that I mentioned. And the same thing applies to Venezuela. But on the other side, when they decided to impose the sanctions on Russia, they were really scared that this is going to impact the elections and is going to cause inflation, not only in the United States, but worldwide. So they created the sanctions with kind of a game within that. And the game basically is, even if you look at the text, so we have the G7 and the EU agreeing to impose sanctions on Russian oil, where the G7 and the EU will not import any crude by December 2022 and no petroleum products by February 2023. Well, if they were really serious from a moral point of view, they should not have even set a date, a future date for it. They should have just stopped it that day. But it wasn't, but they have to balance the issues and their economies and prices, everything else. And that's why they've done it. But if you look at the text, since that time, they said that countries are allowed to import Russian oil if it is modified. So that's in the agreement. Modified means if a third country take that crude, refine it, then I can buy the gasoline. So that's where India came in here. That's where China came in. Okay, if you guys want to import it, go ahead and import it. You are not violating anything. And as long as you send the gasoline and diesel to me, I am fine. So you can see the hypocrisy from day one in those sanctions, because they're still getting the Russian oil in a different form. And then other countries, like, for example, Turkey, they literally import the products from Russia, re-exported as Turkish products. And other countries played the game too. And everyone knew it. It just didn't want to talk about it. Right. India basically became part of the game this way. So what happened is India was, because the refining sector in India is a very powerful, advanced sector. And it's been doing extremely well, and they were supplying, most of their supplies goes to Asia. But there was a development that happened during this political chaos with Ukraine, that made it perfect for the Indian refiners to send their products to Europe. So before that, most of their products went to Asia. But what happened is Kuwait built a massive refinery, Oman built a massive refinery, Saudi Arabia built a new refinery, and the UAE basically had a refinery that they expanded big time. So naturally, what happened now, the Gulf refineries basically started supplying Asia. So they took the market share of the Indian companies, while the Indian companies basically directed their exports to Europe. And that's the whole story when it came about India basically washing the Russian oil and all that stuff. It came through that way. We did the study on this for those. There is no paywall on that for those who are interested. And I'll be happy to send it to you if you'd like to put it in the video or something that they can read all the details and look at all the data. The issue here is all the refineries and all the companies in India are involved in buying Russian oil. It's not only one or two companies without naming names. Yes, some companies basically more dependent on that, but even government oil companies basically be buying the Russian oil. The EU and the G7 created the mechanism called the price cap, which is a joke, never worked, and it does affect the Indian banks when they do the payments, but there are many ways to work around that anyway. But the whole price cap thing is a joke because Russian oil historically been sold way, way higher than the price cap. But the main point here is that if you look at India's petroleum products exports before the Russian invasion of Ukraine and after, it did not change much. This is a fact that the media must realize, because if you read the articles in the media, you would think that India just increased its exports substantially after. That's not correct. All we saw basically is the change in direction from Asia to Europe. But the amount itself did not increase much. It's the same amount. So that's number one. Number two, when India started importing the Russian oil, India's oil demand was growing, which means that this increase in Russian oil imports met some of that increase in demand. But some of it was a replacement to oil from other countries. And it is very important for people, especially in India, to understand this dynamic. Who lost market share in India? Well, if you look at the map and you look at the data, you find out that the first losers were the farthest from India. And as India increases imports from Russia, you move in toward India, and you can see how the movement is. We reach West Africa, then they get rid of West African oil, North Africa. That means the shipping cost plays a big role here. So the whole idea here is, if you look at the dynamics, it is purely economics. It has nothing to do with politics. So India started getting rid of oil from South America, then the United States, then West Africa. That's economics. That has nothing to do with politics. It's not the fact that all of a sudden we have this additional love for Russian oil, and all of a sudden because of politics and because of history and this stuff. No. Some people who are saying this, basically they are missing the point. It's pure economics. All you get to do, just look at the replacement and you can see where the economics is. That was about shipping costs. The final question here is in this regard to this. Let's say there is massive pressure on India to stop importing Russian oil. Okay, tell me about the replacement. Where the replacement is going to come from? We're talking about 2 million barrels, almost 2 million barrels a day. Where the replacement is going to come from? They say, well, Trump wants to sell more oil to India. Well, President Trump does not have additional oil to sell to India. That's the first place. That's the first fact. But there is another fact that is important. Shale oil is light sweet crude. Russian crude is medium sour. These are completely two different markets, two different qualities. Yes, there will be some replacement, probably 100, 200,000 barrels a day, but that's it. The United States cannot supply India with the same quality. And other people will say, well, Gulf states would supply India. Well, Gulf states, for multiple reasons, they are not going to supply that amount. It's a very large amount. And there is no replacement. Norwegian oil basically is going to Europe. U.S. oil is light sweet crude. And Brazil is on the other side of the world. And India does import some from Brazil, by the way. But still, the cost of shipping is massive. So any way you look at it, we might see a reduction in imports from Russia, but definitely not a replacement. And therefore, India will continue to import oil from Russia under all circumstances.
I was going to come to this question later, but since you mentioned that point, I do want to ask how practical it would have been for India to discontinue oil purchased from Russia. You've talked about the consistency, the quality, the types of the oil, and the differences between the U.S. and the Russian output. But how would, if India, let's say hypothetically, chose to discontinue Russian imports completely, how would that affect global prices? And does Russia have alternate markets to supply to?
We have what we've seen since the sanctions being imposed. We've seen the game of musical chairs. For those who are not familiar with the game, but basically they can check it on the web. And musical chairs, basically, families played this for a very long time, where they play music. There will be, let's say, for example, there are 8 people, and they will have 7 chairs in a circle, and people will turn around the circle with the music playing, and then someone is going to stop the music, and everyone has to take a chair. The one who is going to stay without a chair, they become the loser and leave. And then they will take a chair out and keep playing until they get to the final one. But the idea here is they play this, and anyone will grab any chair and sit on it. This is the game of musical chair being played with sanctions. If you don't sit on this chair, you're going to sit on this one. Okay, if you don't sit on this one, you sit on this one. The only difference between the oil market and the game of musical chairs is that in the oil market, there is chair for everyone. So the oil goes from here to here, and that's it. They just keep playing this game and moving the oil around. So the impact here is, if Russian oil cannot find a market simply because it is restricted and there is no replacement, then oil prices will increase substantially. And Trump realizes this. He knows that. He does not want oil prices to go up. They don't want inflation to go up. The European economies are already suffering from high energy prices, and then it will be a disaster for them if oil prices go up. So it is not good for them. And we go back to the original idea that the Trump administration is using Russian oil as a tool, not because they want to reduce Russian exports, simply because they want to pressure on the countries to change and have a trade deal, for example, or a military deal or whatever.
But from what you characterized Trump's approach to enforcing oil sanctions, it sounds extraordinarily opportunistic. And I do wonder, because how would you characterize Trump's approach to oil sanctions across his presidencies? I'm thinking about the Russian sanctions, but also to Iran and Venezuela, because we recently seen news that the president has been ordering attacks on Venezuelan fishing boats, which he claims to be drug smugglers. We've also seen a discontinuation of the waiver for India for the Chabahar port, which India has in Iran, which is vital to India's supply of Afghanistan without having to go through Pakistan. So substantial implications there. I wonder if you could talk about Trump's new hardline approach and how opportunistic it really is. And tagging on to that, I wonder if you could talk about China's role in this, because China seems to be either importing oil from or investing in all those three: Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, with little consequence. So I wonder if you could touch on those two topics.
Um, Generally speaking, when we look at all the sanctions that have been imposed and what's happening on the ground, part of my research over the years is to focus on the unintended consequences of policies and regulations and laws. People always want kind of for one of the general comments like, "Oh, you predicted this and you are right. You predicted this and you are right, and you are predicted this," and I get this all the time. It's not really about predicting this and being right. It is just because I focus on the unintended consequences. So I say things that others don't because of the specialty and because of the research, not because I am that good or anything else at all. It's just I am focusing on things that others are not focusing on. So focusing on the unintended consequences is extremely important here because what's on the ground is completely different from what you hear in the media and what politicians are saying. And this is very important to pay attention to all the time. The United States been fighting the drug war against drug smugglers for over 50 years. They spend billions of dollars every year. Yet, drugs are more widespread in the United States than ever. So now you are going to tell me that they are going to go to the other side of the world and enforce sanctions while they cannot even enforce it at home? Okay. They've been fighting the tax cheaters for over 100 years. And yet, tax cheating is at a record high right now. So as the idea here is, as long as there is money to be made and there is something on the table, someone is going to break the sanctions. And the amount of money made is massive. I mean, you're talking about whether you talk about Kurdistan, Iraq, you talk about Iran, you talk about Venezuela, just think about it. $1 million a day, multiply that by $5, that's $5 million a day, just benefit to the smuggler if he can make it. Who's going to leave that money on the table? $5 million a day. But of course, it's way, the benefits are way larger than that. So the sanctions are going to be broken no matter what. And these are wide seas no one can control. And the techniques that being used are getting more sophisticated. So yes, the United States and others basically have better technology to detect, and the other side has better technologies to hide. Technology is advancing on all sectors here. And I will jump to China and talk about that in a few minutes. But when we look at the sanctions, one of the ways that sanctions being circumvented, which is kind of very funny if you look at the details, you go through the list of tankers that been sanctioned since Biden. Until today, you go through that and search for those tankers. Most of them do not exist today at all. They don't exist. So they are sanctioning what? And the reason why, because when a company, whether a Greek company or others, their tanker is sanctioned, what they do is they change the registry, they change the flag, and sometimes they paint even the tanker different colors or whatever. And all of a sudden you have a new entity, and the old entity just disappeared. So you go to a port, and the port is looking at the list, and that tanker is not on the list. So there are many ways of circumventing those sanctions, and that's really a big problem. Now I want to move to China, because what happened is, if you go back and look at Trump's sanctions on Iran in 2018, we've done a lot of research on this for those interested. He imposed the sanctions on Iran in 2018. Iran exports declined substantially in 2019 as a result of those sanctions. And the Trump administration and those who support sanctions said, well, we can replicate 2019 in 2025 or 2026 because we've done it before. Now we can do it. And our research basically shows, no, you cannot do it because 2025 is no longer 2019. There are major differences between 2019 and 2025. For example, when Iran was exporting oil because of the agreement with Obama in 2014, and the sanctions basically be reduced, in 2018, they were sending that oil to about 20 countries. Now the sanctions are imposed. Some countries panicked. They don't want any problems with Trump. So they stopped importing from Iran. But other countries wanted to import Iranian oil. Now notice that the sanctions are not really on importing Iranian oil. If someone wants to import Iranian oil, they can import it. There is no problem. The problem is the payment. How to pay? You cannot pay. So the only way you can pay the Iranians basically is to create an escrow account in a bank and deposit the money there, but Iran will have no access to it until the sanctions are lifted. So Iran said, okay, I'm going to pay the cost of extraction, I'm going to pay the cost of transportation, I'm going to pay the cost of loading, and then I'm going to get nothing. Because the other country that I'm shipping the oil to is going to give me nothing. So what the heck? I'm not going to export anything. So the Iranians themselves cut their exports because they are not getting the money. Now they talk to the Chinese, and the Chinese said, look, we are going to import that oil from you. Here's the problem. Some of that oil, in terms of crude quality, does not match our refiners. And therefore, we cannot get it. So Iran got stuck. They couldn't export that oil. They couldn't get money. So they did cut their own production and exports as a result of that. But they made an agreement with the Chinese that they want to move to other new fields where the crude quality matches the crude quality of the Chinese refiners. And they ended up with everything in Iran being produced and exported, matching the crude quality that China wants. So what happened in 2019 is not going to happen now. And also, in 2016, Iranian experts basically told the government, look, we have some old fields that are becoming very costly. We have to shut them down and focus on new fields. So they did shut those fields in 2019 too. So that's another reason for the decline. That does not exist today. And then China created a new system for smuggling, advanced system, that kind of technology-based system. At the same time, they created a financial system that is not subject to the US or the EU. So Iran, for example, of course, Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey, they cooperated on creating a new kind of special mechanism. They tried gold, it did not work. They tried national currencies, it did not work. They tried various, even crypto, it did not work. So they tried to trade among each other, nothing worked. So we ended up with the following situation. All those who buy Iranian oil, they deposit the money in a Chinese bank. And then Iran will go to China on a shopping spree, whether those products are from China or China importing from other nations. And then everything basically will be charged against their account in that bank. So they created a system that is not subject to the EU, not subject to the US, and it's working fine for all of them. And if Iran wants something from other countries, despite the sanctions, their agents in China can import it to China and then bring it to Iran. So the financial system is working. On the smuggling side, basically, they developed this system where we cited 9 ways how the Iranian oil is smuggled. But the most common way is for a tanker to go to the waters of Malaysia or Indonesia and literally transfer that crude from the tankers that is known to kind of carry the Iranian crude to another tanker that has no problems at all. And sometimes even they mix it with other countries' crude and it goes to China normally. So if you look at China's official imports of crude, you will never see Iran there. Yet they import about 1.3 million barrels a day from Iran. But it's not there because you see it coming from Malaysia or Indonesia or other countries because of this game. But there are, of course, other games they play. One of the games they played, basically, China and Iran, and this helped Iran, by the way, during the war when Israel attacked Iran, that helped Iran big time. Because what they did is they created a large number of small ports so they can circumvent the sanctions. Because You can't focus on a port and say, well, look, I'm going to do this. A couple of days later, there are no tankers on that port. And you start searching for them and you find them in another port. And China did the same. So China basically received those shipments in ports that are not known to be international ports. The final comment on China is that China, for the last 7-8 years, probably from 2018, 2019, the Chinese leadership is convinced that down the line, there would be a war with the West or there would be sanctions on China. And China's problem is the Malacca Strait. Malacca Strait is a very tight strait. 80% of its imports come from the strait. And the United States or the West, probably they can control that and block China. So they adopted a strategy. The strategy basically is based on several elements. One of them is the reduction of seaborne energy imports. And that includes everything. That includes oil, LNG, coal. So that's number one. Number two, build your domestic supply at any cost. And what we've seen in the last 2 years, their oil production went up. Their natural gas production went up substantially. Massive growth in gas production in China. And they increased their coal production. They increased it to the level where they decided to cut production because they have oversupply. And build solar and wind. Building solar and wind has nothing to do with climate change, as Bloomberg and others try to tell us. This is a strategic decision because it is a domestic source. It enhances your energy security. It enhances your national security. And the more you build, the better off you are, especially if it's scattered around the nation. So they built that capacity to increase their domestic energy production. At the same time, they focus on land-based imports, increasing pipeline gas imports from Russia, which is far away from the United States, far away from the EU, so they cannot reach that, and increase imports of coal from Mongolia. So the strategy is very clear. And then the other element of that strategy is to build massive storage of everything. And we've seen them building the storage on every level to the extent that their natural gas storage is at record high, oil storage at record high, coal storage at record high, every single mineral, every single metal you think about, etc., all of that. So the idea here is they are trying to, based on the numbers, probably they are trying to have at least 90 days of supplies if they're being cut off completely. And I think the ultimate objective is to have it for a year, not only 90 days.
You weren't wrong when you said that the energy market is a combination of politics, geopolitics, and economics. There seem to be so many different factors in here, which is incredible. And I think that's the point that I personally have tried to emphasize, the one about solar power, because India also is expanding its solar output. But that's primarily because its main import is oil, and it doesn't necessarily want to be vulnerable to fluctuating import prices as it was during the 2001 to 2010 when you had post $100 a barrel. So it is a domestic energy and security concern rather than a climate change one. But coming to the focus of this episode, and I think you've dealt substantially with a lot of the questions I had about this, which is the claim that India is fueling Russia's war effort because of its oil purchases. And as you noted, President Trump has slapped India with a 25% sanction, which is in addition to a 25% tariff. So bringing the total to 50% in total, one of the highest in the world, for purchasing Russian oil. And his advisors have gone further in this. They've actually, people like Peter Navarro have claimed that this is, that India is war profiteering, let's say. And he's called the war in Ukraine by Russia, Modi's war. Now, I do wonder, particularly about the funding part of this, that India is financing Russia's war. What is the truth behind these claims? You've noted that there's not been a substantial change in India's oil exports since the outbreak of the war, but there has been a substantial increase, at least as a percentage, from Russia. So do you think that India is really war profiteering? And do India's contributions or its oil payments to Russia make a meaningful difference to the continuation of Russia's war effort in Ukraine?
Generally speaking, let's go back to the idea of the musical chairs game. If India does not buy it, someone else is going to buy it. In fact, when the EU imposed the sanctions on Nayara refinery, the Vaidyanath refinery, there was a lot of confusion in the first 2 weeks. And we've seen tankers carrying Russian oil in the Red Sea, basically just stopping right there in the middle of the sea for several days because they don't know what to do. And some tankers basically were just like completely confused. They don't know what to do. What happened? China bought all that oil that India did not buy. Literally, they bought all of that, they stored it. So the idea here, the game of musical share is going to work no matter what. If you don't buy it, someone else is going to buy it. So that's number one. Number two, for India, basically, again, if they see the EU basically halting all imports from Russia, if they see the United States halting all imports from Russia, well, at least they have an example to follow. But if they don't, 15% of the nuclear power plants in the United States are fueled by Russian enriched uranium. 15%. So if you are an Indian official and looking at this, what you are going to say? So that's an issue. The other issue is, and we heard this from African leaders so many times, and this is kind of sometimes we have to think about a broader picture than this. But we heard this from African leaders say, look, my people are dying for lack of energy. And now you want me to stop importing from Russia so more people in my country die? So it's a powerful argument when you talk about, especially when you talk about Africans, basically, and African leaders. They see it as a matter of life or death. And yet you are telling me to do it while you are still importing from Russia. The EU Europeans are still importing the gas from Russia and enjoying a warm winter within their homes because of it. Why my people will die from cold or heat? So the whole argument basically of linking it to war, kind of, there is a big question mark there.
So I have two more questions regarding wider developments in the oil market and its impact, because if it does impact the price, that does perhaps have an impact on Russia's oil sales. The first one is the OPEC plus unwinding. Now, people not in the oil market, we've heard reports about this. There seems to have been some indication that there was an unexpected increase in the number of oil barrels produced. It's my understanding. Could you just describe this unwinding and perhaps the changes to the unwinding schedule and the amount that have been going on in the oil markets, and how do you think this is going to impact the global oil price and therefore Russia's ability to export oil?
Generally speaking, when we talk about the unwinding, what happened is as I mentioned before, the oil market needs management because it is a natural resource. Has nothing. All this description of OPEC being cartel and this stuff does not even meet the minimum qualifications under U.S. law. So even if you take it to court, it does not meet the conditions. So it's not a cartel. The whole idea here is natural resources need management, and the reason why they need management because the upfront cost is massive relative to the operating cost. Because once you discover the oil, once you spend everything else and you start producing, to start producing right now, basically you can do it through AI and this stuff. You don't need even a single person to be there. So your cost is very minimal, but you already spent $40, $50, $60 million up front. So you can produce at any level. You can produce at any price because your operational cost is very small. So this is different from any other factory, different from any other manufactured products from completely. So it needs management. And what the group did basically is they decided to cut production. The announcement, basically, there were 3 announcements. And the issue here is that this is a temporary fix and we'll bring it back soon. But because of market condition, they delayed it several times. The delay basically just shows you that they are flexible on one side and it's a market management on the other. Finally, they decided to bring it back. The surprise was when they decided, instead of bringing it back over a year, they expedited that. And instead of a year, they brought it back within like 4 or 5 months. And some people panicked because of this. The issue is many analysts basically missed several issues that we focused on in our report, especially starting in April. For example, when they decided to bring the first oil to the market in April, people did not pay attention to the Hajj, or the pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia, which was between May and June. And you have millions of Muslims traveling from all around the world going to Saudi Arabia. What happened during that period is the demand for petroleum products, whether gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, or fuel oil for power plants. As you know, the weather is hot, so air conditioning in the hotel rooms, hundreds of thousands of hotel rooms, it has to stay on 24/7. And you have all the Hajj facilities, etc., all well lit 24/7. So the demand for those products is massive. And therefore, if Saudi Arabia increases production, that's going to go to domestic consumption because of the Hajj. It's not going to go to the market. While analysts did not know about this, they thought all of this is going to go to the international market, and therefore prices would decline to the 40s and 30s. So that was the first thing they missed. But after May and June, you have the summer months. And as you know, when you look at the Middle East and North Africa, the weather in the summer is very hot. And the demand for air conditioning is massive. How they meet that seasonal demand? They burn fuel oil and sometimes even crude oil in power plants. So the domestic demand for oil increases substantially in the summer. So whatever they were going to increase in the summer would be consumed domestically. And that was a major issue. Analysts missed that. That's why prices did not decline. They stayed in the 60s. So those increases from OPEC Plus, or from the group of 8 in OPEC Plus, they just prevented prices from going up. But they did not reduce prices. Because without that, prices would have been between 75 and 80 right now. The other issue that they missed is that Iran been suffering from major problems. And then Israel came in, attacked Iran. We ended up with several problems. Because with the attack and other problems, gas exports from Iran to Iraq stopped. And then when they resumed it, it was at a very low rate. And now we have the summer in Iraq. Iraq is very hot, very warm in the summer. They need the cooling and everything else. So how they are going to generate electricity? The only way they can generate electricity by burning more oil. So instead of exporting that oil, because of the attack on Iran and because other things, now they need more oil to be used domestically. Analysts missed that. But at the same time, because of the war, Israel stopped exporting gas to Jordan and Egypt. And again, it's summer months. So how they are going to compensate for that? Use more oil. They missed that too. Analysts missed that too. So all of that basically contributed to the fact that those increases have not impacted the market, or otherwise you can say they prevented oil prices from going up, but they did not lower prices. Prices remained in the 60s. Now the summer is over. The Hajj is over. So there is more oil available to the market. What's going to happen? Well, usually we have what we call the seasonal decline in demand and seasonal build-up in inventories. So we're going to see that. Some analysts and the IEA, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, they think it's going to be a massive surplus. Well, we will see what's going to happen. The idea that we got to worry about is the following. For the last 3 weeks, we've seen a recent change in China. And that's completely different from what Bloomberg reported. The change basically is the typical Chinese behavior that we've seen in the last 10 years. Buy low, sell high. So we've seen them in the last 3 weeks lowering their imports and using more oil from their storage. Whether this is going to be a trend or not, we don't know. But if it becomes a trend at a high rate, this is concerning for the oil market. But we don't know yet what they are going to do next.
And I think lastly, I do want to ask you, because you've studied the Middle East and you've written about Saudi extensively, and I think the biggest perhaps geopolitical development with concerns to South Asia, which is our field of research, is the Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact. Not just that, but you're seeing a lot of wider developments in the Middle East right now. You've obviously seen Israel's aggression, including the bombing in Qatar. And the recent development is that the US seems to have issued some sort of a security guarantee for Qatar, which is an interesting development. I do wonder what your view of the developments in the Middle East is, because this is obviously a major source of production for energy markets and
Yes.
stereo
I
power.
usually try to avoid politics, but on this issue particular, since I focus on Saudi Arabia and India a lot,
Mhm.
I've seen many Indian officials and influencers in particular talking about this. I think all of them are wrong. And the reason why, there is no fear from the part of Saudi Arabia on India at all. In fact, if you look at the contracts and look at what they deal with and all that stuff, they were not affected at all. From my own point of view, and I could be wrong, okay? Think about it this way. If you are one of the leaders in Saudi Arabia and you see Qatar, who is aligned with the US and aligned with Israel, okay, being bombed, what do you do? So the idea here is, I'm going to bring Pakistan into this. Netanyahu, if you hit me, look who's going to reply to you. It is all about Netanyahu, nothing else. Has nothing to do with India. And the pact basically said, if one country attacked the others, etc. We know that the military might basically is in Pakistan. So if something happened between Pakistan and India, anyone who thinks that the Saudis will be involved, they are wrong. So it is about Netanyahu and Netanyahu alone, and that's it.
Mhm.
Regardless, experts, and you'll see this, you go to YouTube, you go search for all the articles, experts agree that the nuclear program in Pakistan basically is indirectly a Saudi program. And we've been hearing this for decades now. So it is a Saudi program. So there is no change in the formula more than they are just showing Netanyahu, look, don't touch me. That's what it is. Because Netanyahu did threat. If you go back and look at the statements, he did threaten Saudi Arabia. So this is their reply. And therefore, just look at the number of Indian workers and engineers and Indian talent in Saudi Arabia. They are in millions. And they were not affected. Not a single one basically can tell you they were affected by this, or the were in one way or the other basically influenced by this. So that tells you it is really about Netanyahu, and that's it. It has nothing to do with the whether the political stand toward India or the economic stand toward India. I think if you look at Saudi Aramco and others, their investment in India and what they plan to do in India does not fit with the narrative that they are standing against India.
Ajay Srivastava is the founder of the Global Tech Research Initiative, GTRI, and is based in New Delhi, India. As a former Indian Trade Service officer, Ajay was part of India's WTO and FTA negotiating teams and has written extensively on trade policy, trade data analytics, taxation, and digital systems, and is a frequent contributor to several noted publications like the Times of India and the Hindu Business Line. So Ajay, it's great having you on the podcast. Welcome to Beyond the Indus.
Thanks, Tushar. Thanks for inviting me.
So Ajay, just to begin with, Russia's long been an important strategic and defense partner for India, both pre and post the breakup of the Soviet Union. But how important is Russia as an economic partner? Could you give our listeners a breakdown of the trade and economic relations between Russia and India historically? And how important is Russia to India's growth story?
Uh, our relationship on economic front was modest, to say the least. For example, if I look at the data from 2017 to 2021, our oil imports from Russia were less than $2.5 billion a year. That means less than 2% of India's total oil imports. So Russia was not figuring in our energy import things. Number one, why? Because Russia is holds 10% of the world reserves, and it was able to sell oil at the market price to anyone. Then came the Ukraine war and the swift sanctions, with the sanctions from Europe, from G7, from US. Russia was barred from using SWIFT pipeline for transferring the money, which it has to use for getting money, transferring money to its own account. And that's how, and that at that point of time, Russia had no way to sell crude to the general market. It was to find some strategic countries which are willing to buy its crude. At this point of time, it started offering discounts. So before Ukraine war, it was not offering any discount to anyone in the world, not even to India. So it started offering discounts to China and India consulted US on this. US side is on record on this, and US says, okay, you buy oil from Russia because it will keep the world oil prices in control. And so, with the consent of US, India was buying, and our share of imports from Russia had started increasing. So it was less than 2%, I said, till 2021. But 2022, it became 15%. So we imported $25 billion of oil from Russia. In 23, it became from 15% to 35%. So we imported about $49 billion of oil from Russia. And the next year, 2024, the share was 38% of India's total oil imports, which means we bought about $53 billion of oil from Russia. So this was clearly an economic benefit India was deriving, because Russia was offering discounts to India and China, and US had no problem, and we were buying the oil. So, and oil is 80% of India's imports from Russia. Rest are fertilizer and something. So, on if I say economic and trade relationships, it's basically concentrated on energy and mostly the oil.
And maybe you could go a little bit deeper into the India-Russia oil trade, because as you noted, 80% of India's imports from Russia are oil, but that wasn't the case necessarily before the outbreak of the Ukraine war. So I wonder if you could talk about maybe the breakdown of the India-Russia oil trade. What processing and value addition does India provide, and why India in particular has emerged as, this oil export behemoth after the Ukraine war. Oil imports from Russia have increased substantially, and oil exports to Europe have also increased substantially. And I want you to also talk about this claim by the Trump administration, which is this is war profiteering. Some officials have gone so far as to call this Modi's war, which I think is a bit ludicrous. But the question does stand, why does India continue to import Russian energy in face of sanctions? Is it lucrative or necessary, or just, defiance of an independent country? Particularly when the savings from the cheaper oil do not seem to have been passed on to the ordinary consumer in India.
Okay, I'll answer the questions in reverse order. Why the savings were not passed to the general? So, how can we how can we say savings were not passed to the general consumer? Because petroleum prices, they were not cut. That's not the way to look at the things. Government earns money from, say, 100 heads, and it spends on 2,000 heads. So, for example, just last 10 days back, Government of India has announced major GST cuts, which will be much more than the money we ever earned from this discounted oil. So we are earning from oil, and then we are distributing through GST cuts and so many other welfare programs. So it's totally wrong to say we have not passed. We are passing in our own way. That's number one. And then we talk about oil processing, war profiteering. Let's handle these one by one. So Uh, but as I say, we were not buying from Russia because it was not cheap before Ukraine oil, before Ukraine war, and then it became cheap. Russia was not allowed to sell to the international market, and US agreed that India should buy to keep the energy prices low. So India was buying. So India was getting a cheap oil. India and US was on India's side. Mr. Garcetti, the earlier US ambassador, he's on record talking about these things. And then what India does? India has one of the best in the world set of refineries, both the private sector refineries and the public sector refineries. So we bring the oil from there and we convert into gasoline or diesel or ATF and so many other things. And we use domestically and we export everywhere. We were exporting to Europe, we were exporting to America, we are exporting so many other countries. So we were buying, and as I say, at the peak, the Russian oil was just 38% in 2024. Before that, it was lower. So that means we are buying most oil from so many other countries also. All this oil we process into petrochemicals and we sell it. That's our business. Like we buy diamonds, polish it and sell it. We buy gold and convert it into jewelry and sell it. The same way we buy crude oil, process it because our refineries are one of the largest and best in processing say sour crude, complicated crude, and that's the business model. And we don't find any problem. Now talking about war profiteering. Now this is interesting. So when US says that India is fueling Russia war by buying oil, it says two, three things. So if you look at the data, 2024 data, then China is the largest buyer of Russian oil. India is the number two buyer. And US knows, Mr. Trump knows that he cannot even point a finger towards China because China has caught them on the rare earth thing. I know at least 500 more items on which China can blackmail them. So he realized, Trump administration realized that they have to forget about China, punishing China, even talking about it, China. So they started talking about China with great respect. Then you see Europe is also buying this oil. Their 18th sanction was about that we'll be buying oil from Russia, but if it comes at this price and lower, so they were buying oil from, not only oil, they were buying from a lot of metals from Russia. Europe was buying. US was buying platinum and so many other metals. Everybody was buying. Why name India? Because he could not name others. India is the fall guy. India is made fall guy because I think amongst his MAGA crowd, Mr. Trump has to look to project a Rambo-like image. Now he cannot do that with China, with Europe, and he did that with China in the first war, but second time he was beaten very heavily when China stopped the supplies of rare earths. So he has to find a fall guy. That fall guy was India, and why India became the fall guy? One of the theories is that India-Pakistan war, Trump tried to take credit that he stopped the war, and we openly said no, he didn't stop the war. Indian government has a 50-year-old policy that we say India-Pakistan things are bilateral, no third-party mediation is allowed. So we just reiterated that. But Trump thought India came between him and his Nobel Peace Prize. And that's how India was fall guy. And because they could not catch China and because he has to look Rambo-like amongst his MAGA crowd. And that's why all these things happen.
Right, and that's a fair point, and we did deal with some of the dynamics of the reasons why President Trump might have imposed tariffs on India in our last episode. But I suppose, independent of the U.S.'s foreign policy, I do want to ask you about the necessity of buying oil from Russia specifically, because it can be said that they are taking out a pretty brutal war on Ukraine, and we're trying to build up relations with the Europeans, and Russia is, allied to perhaps India's long-term strategic competitor, which is China. So my question is, what is the absolute necessity of buying Russian oil in face of potential sanctions? Is it that important, a price differential if you buy from Russia versus other markets?
So first I say, when I look at the trade data, the recent trade data, I find that difference between the oil price of other countries and Russia is diminishing. And most of the refineries in India, then the private sector. I think the imports will start coming down very heavily. It may stop. There is no need for the government to intervene. But that's one point. I'm on to the other point. What's the morality of it? Whole of the world is pointing at India, but these sanctions against Russia, they are not UN sanctions. We are supposed to be following UN sanction in the global order. These sanctions are by US or Europe, both of which by Russian, uh, Russian things, oil or metals, all those things. So, and second, if you read Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, he says if US has not pushed NATO for eastward expansion, this war would never have started. And then we see if US is so uh, desperate to stop the war, just for one day, he can ask Mr. Elon Musk to stop the supplies of internet through Starlink in Ukraine. All the war will stop in one day. In the past 3 years, US supplied arms worth $150 billion. So who is fueling the war of Russia? It's the US and its allies who are fueling the war. And India is just buying in oil. One more point is there, Tushar, here. So you must have seen that US has entered into many trade negotiations in the past 1 month, say with Europe, with Japan, UK, and few more countries. In all these negotiations, the headline thing is that you buy all energy from us. You buy oil and gas from us, not from Russia. For example, Europe was buying energy from Russia, and now Europe has committed they will stop altogether Russian buys. They will buy energy, which means oil, gas, nuclear, mostly oil and gas, $250 billion every year from US. Now, when I was looking at the data, raw data, what it tells, it's very shocking. World should know about this. So, US exports crude oil of $114 billion in 2024 and imported crude oil of $174 billion. So, $60 billion of crude oil deficit is there. They import more. On what grounds they are going to say they are going to supply to the whole of the world? I find Europe should do the maths and understand. So, world may be leading to a big energy crisis very soon if we listen to the US. I think all these things should be debated. And unless there is ulterior motive about capturing Russian oil and using it as some other country's oil, it has happened in the past. So, I think this energy crisis angle, it pains me, it shocks me when I heard this. I mean, US has only shale oil, light shale oil. If Indian refineries have to use that, they have to put expensive refinements to process that. And it's very expensive, below $55 a barrel. It's not sustainable. It's expensive to extract. Shale, 60% of the shale wells, they die in the very first year. And they want to be the supplier of the oil to the world. Not tenable. I don't know why nobody is talking about this thing.
Right, and I suppose you could make that point that this is not a UN-led sanctions. These are you know uh, countries or groups of countries that are imposing sanctions as a consequence of their own geopolitical issues, which certainly don't carry the legitimacy of a UN sanction or perhaps the sanctions of Iran, which are for its nuclear program. So you can understand that. So I can understand that point of that. That's a different perspective altogether, but. I do want to also get into the details and mechanics of the India-Russia trade. So it's very good to have someone who understands the world of trade in and out so deeply, because I wonder if you could help us understand the mechanics of the India-Russia oil trade in light of the sanctions, particularly the financing part of this. Because how are the US and EU sanctions structured, and how does India get around these sanctions and pay for oil imports? If it's true, as Russia has claimed, that most of the trade is done in local currencies, which currencies are used, and what does Russia do with these payments? And the broader question is it plausible, at least for the India Russia trade, that Russia is using these payments to somehow sustain or prolong its war effort in Ukraine?
So I don't have any problem with the US sanction, European sanction. They are playing their own geopolitical game. I may not need to agree with them, but they're playing their own games. My problem is with the SWIFT. SWIFT is a society. They are supposed to be apolitical, above board. They are just a financial pipeline for transferring euros and dollars between two countries. How come they become the part of applying sanctions? They should be above this. Now, as now local currency trading has started happening because SWIFT jumped into it. So US is pressurizing apolitical organizations like SWIFT to become political, to play to its agenda. So when SWIFT in 2022, it stopped most important Russian banks from operating, from transferring money through it, then then there was a problem for Russia. So so the way China buys, the way India buys is like this. Suppose I I buy I import about $70 billion from Russia and I export only $5 billion. So the $5 billion I can settle in local currency, but there is a huge gap. Indian rupee is not convertible, so I cannot set that because Russia will have no use for that. So initially we thought, okay, Russia can invest in India, Indian stock market and long-term bonds and all those things, but there was a limit uh, beyond certain extent for that. So we started settling trade in dirhams. So we heard that about 25% trade was settled in dirham. Of course, there is no official word from both the sides. This is the research which says this. Very small part, 4-5% was settled in yuan. But I want to tell you that so mostly it's local currency trading, and local currency trading settled in in the currencies of the countries with which India has brisk trade. So dirham, UAE, we have brisk trade. We can settle whatever dirham we have earned from UAE to settle for Russian dues. And one thing which everybody ignores is that all these sanctions will fall down. What I'm going to talk is not any official news, but I'm just giving you my thinking. What if a country who wants to pay and cannot pay in dollar pounds, how I cannot pay in gold? I can supply gold. Gold is internationally recognized, almost a currency only, highly liquid. So I think these things must be happening. They're not in the radar. So I don't have any specific information about this, but this is not a big issue. So they feel if they cut the SWIFT, what will happen if you cut the SWIFT? People will think about developing alternate to SWIFT. That's what China, Russia, Saudi are working on it, and something will come out in 2-3 years. We'll see something. And so so I don't support de-dollarization because I think it's a highly liquid, highly predictable currencies. It's a great means of exchange. But if America weaponizes everything, even the agencies like SWIFT, then countries will have to. Everybody is growing. Everybody is growing strong in their own way. We are not going to follow all your dictates, even wrong dictates. So alternate to SWIFT are being developed. Local currency trading will is gaining ground, and I love local currency trading because Tushar, between a buyer and a seller, suppose I want to sell this pen to you, then first I buy dollars in India, paying rupees. So I pay dollar premium here. You receive dollar at your end, and then you convert that dollar into your currency. You pay again premium to the bank. Both way premium, your paying premium, my paying premium is 3 to 5%. If we agree to settle trade in some local currency means or some such means, we both end up saving. So it's not hurting, it's not anti-dollar. It's because we are being a savvy businessman. That's what we are doing. So people are noticing these things, and these transactions have increased tremendously. And I think in the next 6 months to 12 months, we'll see a net outflow that how I mean, much of the world trade, a part of the world trade is shifting towards these mechanisms.
Right, and it's very interesting you say that because I also wonder in terms of I was thinking in terms of how would Russia use rupees or dirhams, for instance, specifically to buy weapons because it does seem that it produces weapons on its own or it imports weapon systems from China in terms of fueling that war. But you didn't. I mean, that's a very good point that they're just going to develop alternate systems of trade and that gold is accepted. I'm pretty sure every country in the world will be happy to accept gold. We've seen the price of gold also skyrocketing, even as the US dollar has not performed that well. So that's a great point you make. And I wonder if you could talk about how these local currency trades impact Russia's war on Ukraine. Because if Russia, let's say, uses SWIFT and use the dollars, euros, which are widely accepted, you could plausibly make the argument that this could lead to imports of, critical parts, for instance, or weapon systems. But if you restrict that trade, it limits Russia's ability to some extent, at least, to make those purchases. Um, but I wonder if this switch to local currencies, the dirhams or rupees, affects Russia's ability to carry out the war in Ukraine? Or is it your view that it's going to get those parts anyway, or it's going to get the supplies anyway? It's not going to be impacted in its ability to continue that war, maybe because it also gets support from China. How do you see that conundrum?
I have an indirect answer to this, Tushar. That answer is when look at the price at which Russian oil is available, that differential with other countries is disappearing. That means Russia is getting the market price the way it used to get before Ukraine war. I don't know how it's happening. Still, sanctions are there. That means it's getting either the payment which it's able to use, like it can use dollar to buy anything. It could be in crypto, it could be in gold, it could be in yuan. It buys a lot of things from China. So, but this single factor, that Russian oil price, dollar per barrel, is same as the price of other oil. It doesn't use. It was not the case 2 years back, and that's why I say, because that margin is disappearing, India's private sector will stop buying, not because any love for Russia is reduced, but because it's not making economic sense. It was making economic sense, then that's why they started buying. Now it stops making, so that buying may come down. So my guess is that Russia is able to use all, whatever way it's getting in crypto, in gold, in yuan, it's able to use fully at the market rate.
Right. And I guess my next question has to do with the oil sanction, let's say, that the US has put of 25% over and above 25% tariffs, bringing India's total to 50%, one of the highest rates in the world. Now, you've talked a lot about how the natural, reduction, the differential reduction in the prices of oil between Russia and the global markets will naturally lead to India's private producers importing less Russian oil. But I wonder if, just for the sake of giving Trump a win, or perhaps like, eliminating the sanction tariff on India, whether India should make more proactive steps towards reducing Russian oil. That is to say, would India gain more from eliminating imports of Russian oil to secure a lower tariff from the United States, because the United States is one of the biggest or the biggest destination for Indian imports. And I also want to ask you this in the context of US India and US Russia relations. What is the trajectory of the US India relation and the US Russia relations from now on, especially after this so called betrayal that we've seen from the United States?
So about us not buying Russian oil to please US, I think that may happen automatically because that price advantage is disappearing. That may happen automatically. Otherwise, in principle, I'm opposed to it. India should not do that just to please the US, because it's such a timid superpower that the country which is importing max oil is not even naming the country China. It's naming the country because they find India weak. That's why they're naming the country. So all these things, for me, if I have to do a business, if you don't respect to me, I can suffer all the losses. We are not export driven economy. Our exports are just 20% of our GDP. US exports are 20% of our goods exports. So about 4% of GDP. If they come to half, it's fine, we'll absorb. Some problem is there, pain will be there. But Russian problem, I think it will solve by itself in 1 or 2 months' time. But America, Russian oil is just today's problem for America. They can name 10 more problems tomorrow. They talk about new things every day. For example, I'll tell you something very interesting. So, India does not allow the import of, say, cheese made out of milk of a cow, which has been fed the meat of another cow because of cultural sensitivity. So, Trump administration says, no, this is nonsense, this is unscientific, you should do it. We say it's not possible. So, it's a big issue. So, they have 200 such issues. Similarly, they want us to open everything. 95% of their exports to India are industrial goods. We say we are willing to eliminate tariffs on 95%, everything, all industrial goods. So, tariff problem is solved from day one on 95% of your exports. Be happy about that. No, 3-4% are agriculture products and dairy. You must remove them. How to tell him that 700 million farmers, their livelihood depends on them. They are very inefficient, unproductive almost. And if we allow opening of agriculture, basic agriculture, say wheat, rice, remove tariff restrictions, then something very disastrous may happen. I'll tell you what may happen. So, US was after almost all the developing countries to remove restrictions on wheat and rice. And get they could pressurize Africa to remove these restrictions. So what happened is US agriculture is highly subsidized, and in 1 year they had bumper crop, and they supplied wheat and rice at 1/3 the African price to African market. So their farmers could not sell anything in their domestic market, and they suffered. But next year they thought, my God, there is no market for us, so let's not even do the sowing work. They did not sow it. It so happened next year in US that crop were not so good, so they did not supply. The price were very high. So African market, the starvation conditions were there, and I hear 4 to 10 million people died in Nigeria and Ghana. We don't want that to happen in India. So core agriculture is not a trade subject where inefficient poor people is there. We don't want that to happen in India, and you should understand that.
Right. And just a follow up to that, because it's good to have someone who's familiar with the WTO and trade negotiations here, because part of my training as a development economist was to understand these, the differential sort of power levels that countries like US and others have. You can think about, the Brazil and the US cotton dispute, where, even though Brazil, I think the international code ruled in favor of Brazil, but the US simply said, hey, either you come to a compromise with us, or you will suffer in other areas. So I wonder, my biggest question through all of these tariffs that the US has been imposing is, what is the WTO doing about this? I mean, isn't the entire point of all these, different negotiation rounds, the GATT before that, the whole idea was we'll create a framework, a reliable framework, where big countries and small countries, can't just use trade as a war weapon against each other. What is the WTO doing? Is it powerless to stop any of the US's actions right now?
So first, let's understand what WTO says. How India is allowed to maintain higher tariffs. How US is bound tariff for US is at 2 to 3% only. So when the WTO was transitioning from GATT to WTO in January 1995, then US and EU, they wanted to introduce new subjects in the WTO. They were services, they were intellectual property rights, that TRIPS, and they wanted the WTO to agree to whatever agriculture subsidies they were giving. So in the GATT system, it was basically tariff cut negotiations, but they wanted these new things. And they wanted a very strong dispute settlement mechanism, so that if any country does anything at the pharma front, violate any IPR, they should be punished. They had the great confidence that services, they are the people who will be doing wonders. So they did for that. And so India and many other countries agreed to this on condition that we are in the very low stage of development, allow us to retain higher tariffs, higher bound tariffs. And they agreed. So it was an agreement that India and China say, okay, we allow you introduce items of your interest, trips, agriculture subsidies, services, and in return, you agree to our retaining higher tariffs. That was the goal, and that's how it was happening. So today also India's tariffs may look high, but they are within India's commitments to the WTO. But we cannot say that about the US. Now they violate WTO on so many counts, not only higher tariffs, but WTO cardinal principle is MFN principle, most favored nation principle, which says you have to charge for for example, for this pen, you have to charge the same tariff with everyone. Now this country specific tariffs, they are charging different from different. So they threw the WTO book out of the window, and did it very systematically. Uh, US lost many cases because of its policies at the WTO, so they were annoyed, and uh, the WTO has a very effective dispute settlement mechanism. So first panel stage decisions were coming quickly, and then appellate body was there. So US never allowed the appellate body judges who were retiring to be replaced with the new judges. So appellate body doesn't exist today; it's maimed totally, and that's why WTO cannot act against the US. And
That's extraordinary. I mean, that is such a move against the so-called we hear about rules-based international order, and that's essentially handicapping an important body in that.
so Tushar, for me, worse is US is not gaining. During Mr. Trump's first term, when he started his trade war, it was at limited level, 10% on aluminum, 25% steel on most nations, and many more tariffs on China. And then Biden administration continues this. So I was studying what's the impact of this, who won, who lost. So if we compare the US imports between 2017 and 2024, US global imports increased by $800 billion. That means no new manufacturing. Your reliance on the world was increasing despite tariffs. China's global exports during this period increased by $1 trillion. China was supplying directly more to US and indirectly through intermediate goods via Mexico, via Vietnam, and so many other countries. So US didn't gain anything. And last time they targeted basically China. This time they are targeting everyone with some tariffs or the other. And this time it will be far worse for them. And second thing which I find very astonishing is nobody is raising a voice. US is doing what it's doing. I don't have any problem with the US. But I thought some big countries or the continents like Europe or Japan, except for China, nobody. So China talks very straight. That's why Mr. Trump never dared to mess with them.
And I want to ask about, the trade negotiations between both India and the US and subsequently with the EU. But starting with the US, we've seen some thawing, let's say, at least in certain public statements from President Trump, that there might be a breakthrough in the, India-US trade negotiations. Do you have any insights on how that negotiation is going or might go, and by when we might have a better tariff agreement and a trade agreement with the United States?
Some interim ministers are on record that deal may happen by November, and similar sentiments were expressed by Mr. Trump a fortnight back. But I am unable to convince myself about these things on simple one ground. They have US has lost the court case, the Court of International Trade in US. They say US the use of that law that tariffs must be used because the national emergency, national security problem because of this high trade deficit. They outlawed that. Appellate court also outlawed that. So now the whole case is US Supreme Court. They have to decide on this thing. And in their affidavit, US has named India. US says US wants to justify its power to retain to retain or impose ever new tariffs on all countries by citing case of India. Else, how else we are going to punish countries like India who are fueling war in Russia? So we want this power to punish countries like India. So when they are doing this, how they are going to drop Russian oil tariff on India? If they are doing that, then entire tariff thing goes down at the Supreme Court. Their thing, and unless Russian tariff go, that outcome is not possible. It's not feasible.
So I want to ask about, a potential other trade partner or ally that India could, develop relations with. Based in Berlin, you're seeing a lot of activity around the India-EU relationship. And India has been stepping up relations with other global partners, signing FTAs with the UK, for instance. And the FTA in the works with the EU, which is the world's largest trading bloc, has also a lot of potential. What is your view on the growing trade and strategic partnerships with the EU? Since the EU is one of the few blocs that can actually serve as a counterweight or alternative to the US consumer market, what is your outlook on the deepening India-EU partnership?
So India's exports to EU are already $75 billion, and it's a growing market for India. And I think both the countries are at a fairly advanced stage of concluding the negotiations. I think almost every month meetings are happening where big teams of over 50 people, they travel from Europe to India and back. And so these things are going on very vigorously. But we have to see, nothing is decided until everything is decided. For example, a big elephant in the room or persons like me is how EU is going to address this carbon border adjustment measure. EU will be charging tax from January next year, or January 2026, and EU started collecting data for that scheme, CBAM scheme. Uh, it started collecting data from October last year, October 23, and many of our MSMEs, they could not provide data, and our exports of steel and aluminum already down by 24%. So I think both the sides have to sit together and talk about how to resolve these issues. Else, what happens is that EU goods will be entering India at zero tariffs. Indian goods will be charged CBAM and Deforestation Act, and so many other EU's environmental measures are there. So that's one elephant in the room. Rest, I don't see much problem in this.
And if you had, you've been involved in many trade negotiations for India, and if you had to, convey a message to, let's say, the people working on the EU side with India as to what they could do to improve or speed up the FTA negotiations, what message could you, or what advice would you have for people on the EU side, now that you're in a civilian capacity?
No, I say understand our realities. We are a poor country. Half the population is just struggling to get livelihood. So one good thing is that both EU and India, they recognize agriculture as sensitive subject. That's not the case with America. So EU is sensitive about these things. So I say recognize that we are a poor country and we are willing to open most of the industrial goods. For agriculture and dairy will be slightly conservative because it's a livelihood issue for us. It's not a trade issue for us. And we don't demand access in these issues from you also.
Fantastic. So, wise words, and hopefully, this partnership with the EU and India does blossom, just to provide alternatives, to the U.S. consumer market, because it does seem that the U.S. is going through an unusual phase, and we're not sure what might come out of this, whether it's an isolationist period or whether it's a restoration to, the U.S.'s traditional role in the world. But Ajay, thanks so much for joining us. That was very fascinating.
Very nice talking to you, Tushar. Thanks for inviting me.